Hello. I didn't hear about this conference till about 2 weeks ago. And then I think it was Darius, who's running this whole show, contacted me and said that somebody in the community thought that I had something to say that might be worth listening to for this TEDx thing. And I thought, oh, that's cool. I know about TED. I should be able to talk about something I really think is important. And then Darius said, you've got 6 minutes. And I thought, well, I better scale back. And then I thought, no, I'm not going to scale back. I'm going to try something that I always wanted to do, and that was I thought I'd try to redefine reality in 6 minutes. So hold on to your hats.
Hold on to your hats, buccos. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is about to redefine reality in 6 minutes, an ostentatious claim if there ever was one. But apart from the psychologist's grandiosity, which is the product of his narcissism, why would he use TEDx to redefine reality? Why wouldn't he speak about the subject he claims most of his work is predicated on, the Holocaust? Well, as it happens, he is speaking about the Holocaust, albeit in a crypto-fascist code, one replete with thinly veiled allusions to Nazism, Satanism, and occultism. I know, it sounds improbable, if not fantastical, and this is the internet, where half-baked ideas abound. But I will work to support my claims. And given that I'll be translating a cipher created by a schizophrenic, Peterson was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 2020, I would ask for patience and leeway.
So the reality I'm going to talk to you about today is it's the reality that the people that you've listened to today who were inspired, it's the reality that they live in. And what I'm going to talk to you about, I don't believe is metaphysics. I truly believe that what I'm going to talk to you about, it's the most real thing I know. And knowing it is something that's completely changed my life.
He's going to talk about the most real thing he knows, which he refers to as it. However, as you will see, he will not name it or unpack what it is, because, as I said, he's speaking in code. The most real thing he knows is a schizophrenic delusion that compels him to tell others, in a language they do not understand, that what we need is Nazism and another Holocaust, or we should take our cues from mass shooters and murder innocents. To be certain, Peterson is obsessed with the demise of innocence and has said he could work at a Nazi death camp with happiness and feeling deeply satisfied. He has said repeatedly that deep down he's an Auschwitz guard and tells his audiences that they are too.
And I think the people that you listen to today who've changed their lives in various ways and the lives of other people know this too. And I also think that you'll see that what I'm going to tell you, you already know too, but you don't know you know it.
To be sure, you need reminding that, like JP, you're also a Nazi, hence why he's forever telling his listeners,
and be aware that you are like that, even though you don't want to think you are, right? Because no one wants to think they're a Nazi, but everybody is one. So, look, it was 95% participation in Germany, and like the only thing that distinguishes, the average person from Hitler is that Hitler was an organizational genius. That's the distinction. It's not the bloody motivation. It's the ability.
We're all motivated to be like Hitler, but unfortunately we lack his talent and intelligence. Or, as Peterson writes in Maps of Meaning, granted the opportunity, how many of us would not be Hitlers, assuming we had the ambition, dedication, and power of organization, which is highly unlikely. Remember the phrase power of organization. We'll come back to it. That we would all be Hitlers, if blessed with the drive and know-how, is part of it, that is, the most real thing Peterson knows. Sometimes he states it overtly, like when he told Joe Rogan that he can see Nazi as an aspect of his personality, and other times covertly, as he does in this TEDx talk.
And it's so great to be able to learn something you already know so that it can be made conscious and explicit, and that's what I'm going to try to do.
He's going to try to make it explicit? Why not just come right out and say what it is? Peterson almost never begins talks by saying he's going to make something explicit, but he has on at least one other occasion, captured in his oldest known video, a 1996 lecture from Harvard entitled Maps of Meaning, Part 1. Therein, he said he wanted to understand why normal people participated in the Holocaust. He didn't want to speak in abstractions, he specified, but rather to get down to brass tacks. Only he did the opposite, lecturing on the behavior of rats, scorpions who commit suicide, violent chimpanzees, Milton's Satan, and the all-seeing eye of Horus. He never came close to broaching the question he claimed the course was supposed to answer, unless you count his theory that the Nazis murdered the Jews because they enjoyed it. Also, in the rare instances he even spoke about Nazism, he praised and defended Hitler. Not that any of his students appeared to notice, but then it was only Harvard. Be aware that Peterson has admitted that when he lectured at Harvard, he was so depressed and anxiety-ridden that he thought he might have to resign. And while supposedly trying to answer the question, why did normal people help facilitate the Holocaust, he linked depression and anxiety to schizophrenia and spoke about that disorder in ways that were clearly autobiographical. For instance, he described what it was like to hear schizophrenic voices, and in his book Maps of Meaning, he talks about hearing a chastising voice after experiencing a psychological split. He also lectured about the pain schizophrenics feel when their brain flips from one mode to another. He said this pain was so excruciating that you felt like you were going to die. So once more, if my explanations of Peterson's code seem implausible, please understand that I'm trying to convey the worldview of someone with a severe psychological illness. Please do not confuse the subject with the person describing the subject.
So there's lots of slides and there's lots of words, and so away we go. First, I believe that people suffer more than they have to because we profoundly misunderstand what's real. We're blinded to what's truly fundamental by the things that present themselves most easily to our perceptions. Thus, we fail to realize what is most genuine and important. We believe that the world is made out of objects.
When he said people suffer more than they have to because we profoundly misunderstand what's real, he meant we schizophrenics suffer more than we have to and misunderstand what's real because we're psychotic. He's trying to communicate with people like him, hence why his critics often admit they don't understand what he's saying. Peterson's crypto-fascist code is simultaneously a schizoid code, frequently comprised of broken or unnatural language, or what psychologists call loose associations. Moving on to the surrealist painting he showed, it's The Son of Man by René Magritte. To Peterson's way of thinking, it would have connections to Nazism and Satanism, while acting as a clandestine reference to himself. Bearing in mind that Peterson has lectured on Nazi official art and degenerate art, René Magritte was Belgian, and during the occupation of Belgium, he stopped producing surrealist art because the occupiers considered it degenerate. Out of fear, he began creating portraits that were bland and conformist. Magritte said, "The confusion and panic that surrealism wanted to create in order to bring everything into question was achieved much better by the Nazi idiots than by us." There's the Nazi connection. As for the Satan connection, the Son of Man is a biblical term interchangeable with the Son of God, and Peterson has claimed that Satan was Jesus' brother, or the other Son of God. This is not a Christian view, but then Peterson is not a Christian. In the book of Revelation, where Satan appears as the great red dragon, John of Patmos has a vision of the Son of Man, who has the keys of hell and death, eyes like blazing fire, and a sword coming out of his mouth. And Peterson has gushed about Revelation, saying, the devil appears in the vision with a sword coming out of his mouth. In Maps of Meaning, which Peterson claims is mostly about the Holocaust, he writes about the Son of Man in connection with a sketch he did while in a drunken rage. He says he created a frightening picture of the crucified Christ, glaring, judgmental, demonic, with a cobra wrapped around his naked waist, like a belt. In Norway, in a talk where he relayed what he called a joke about the Jews being gassed to death, accused a politician who had spoken about Kristallnacht of virtue signaling, and defended Canada's most infamous neo-Nazi, he also spoke about his sketch and how it led to the writing of Maps of Meaning.
You know, the Christianity that my mother practiced in particular, I'd abandoned that when I was like 13, and so I didn't have any structure to orient me at all. And so I was experimenting a little bit with artistic production at this point, not a lot, but a bit. And so I took out this canvas from my closet, and I sat down and I sketched out this picture. And I just let my imagination roam. And what came out was it was a crucifixion, and there was I drew a picture of Christ on the crucifixion, but with a very judgmental face, very angry face, and with a snake wrapped around his waist. And it was a really harsh picture. It was like an expressionist picture. Not that I have the talent of an expressionist, but that's what it was. And I thought, I mean, I wasn't thinking, I didn't think that I was thinking in religious terms at that point at all. And I was an absolutely sporadic churchgoer, and I was absolutely shocked by this picture. I thought, where the hell did this come from? What did that possibly mean?
The sketch of Christ wasn't inspired by Christianity, he emphasizes. Indeed, it was inspired by Satanism.
And so that was the painting. And it was like, and I was asking a question, that was the thing, eh? I was asking a question. I was asking, like, what would I have to do to set this, what would I have to do to set the situation that I'm in right? And so then I drew this picture, and the picture had the answer. I mean, artistic production always has the answer. That's where the answers come from, and so that was a manifestation of imagination. It was part of me attempting in its symbolic mode of personified thinking to deliver a message. And so I swore that night that I was going to do whatever it took to set myself right, period, whatever. And I was dead serious about that. And so that was the moment. And then I don't know what I did with that picture. I hid it in my closet because I was so freaked out by it. I thought, what the hell is this? It's like some schizophrenic nightmare. It's like underneath the covers with that thing. But it wasn't long after that I wrote the first essay that eventually turned into this Maps of Meaning book.
His sketch was the upshot of a schizophrenic nightmare, he joked, only the humor falls flat when you realize that in Maps of Meaning, he relays his story about the cobra strangling Christ on the cross, one page after he describes his psychic split, the subsequent appearance in his mind of an admonishing voice with eyes that commented on nearly everything he said, and descriptions of hyper-realistic nightmares about nuclear detonations. Peterson's claim to not know where the idea for the sketch came from is a lie. Most of his ideas are stolen from Adolf Hitler, Friedrich Nietzsche, Carl Jung, and Aleister Crowley. The idea for the sketch likely came from Crowley. Aleister Crowley was a Satanist who became obsessed with and tried to contact Adolf Hitler in the hope that his religion, known as Thelema, could become the official faith of the Third Reich. Crowley mailed Hitler a copy of his Book of the Law, although there is no evidence it got through. In that book, Crowley identifies as the Egyptian god Horus to say, "With my hawk's head I peck at the eyes of Jesus as he hangs on the cross." Horus was the godhead of Crowley's religion and a stand-in for Lucifer. Crowley wore a conical hat on which there was an image of the all-seeing eye of Horus. And Horus is the god Peterson is always going on about, the god who resurrects the Egyptian state after the death of his father, Osiris. Horus is the deity Peterson says he became in a vision wherein he flew over pyramids. On the left is a picture of Crowley dressed as Horus's son, and on the right is a picture of Peterson dressed like Crowley. In Thelema, Horus takes different names and forms, for example, a hawk, falcon, eagle, and winged snake. With regard to the winged snake, the cobra wrapped around Christ's waist was likely meant to be this version of Horus, that is, the devil. In an apparent come to Lucifer moment, one that Peterson claims defined his future, he created the picture of the devil strangling the king of the Jews. Peterson has referred to Hitler as the devil multiple times, for instance saying that the Germans brought out the devil in Hitler and insisting that we must give the devil his due, or respect Hitler. Peterson has also said that, archetypally, Hitler was indistinguishable from Lucifer, and he claims in 12 Rules for Life that Lucifer represents the spirit of reason. And that's because Peterson believes what is reasonable is strangling Judeo-Christian values and becoming gods. Hence why he talks about Nietzsche's notion about the death of God and how Nietzsche believed we needed to become gods. In Maps of Meaning, Peterson quotes Nietzsche to ask, "Must we not ourselves become gods?" And in a lecture series produced by TV Ontario, Peterson named one of the Maps of Meaning lectures, "Becoming Like Gods." In Australia, Peterson said, Nietzsche thought that the collapse of the Judeo-Christian structure would be absolutely catastrophic for the West, and that we'd have to create our own values. We'd have to take the place of what was once, let's say, externalized and divine onto ourselves. You know, it's a hell of a theory. As for the Judeo-Christian structure, we see Peterson's interest in it in the first paragraph of the preface in Maps of Meaning, which is called Descensus ad Inferos, an allusion to the descent of Christ into hell. Peterson writes, "When I grew up, most people still attended church. Furthermore, all the rules and expectations that made up middle-class society were Judeo-Christian in nature. Even the increasing number of those who could not tolerate formal ritual and belief still implicitly accepted, still acted out, the rules that made up the Christian game." So, straight away, in a book supposedly about the Holocaust, we see JP being critical of Jewish influence in a predominantly white northern society. In Alberta, no less, a Canadian province with an ugly history of populism, anti-Semitism, and neo-Nazism. Anyway, he goes on to talk about how he rejected the Christian game, saying, "Religion was for the ignorant, weak, and superstitious. I stopped attending church and joined the modern world. Although I had grown up in a Christian environment and had a successful and happy childhood, in at least partial consequence, I was more than willing to throw aside the structure that had fostered me." He wanted to throw aside the Judeo-Christian structure that had helped shape him. And Nietzsche thought that the collapse of this structure would prompt people to replace God by becoming gods. What a coincidence, because for Crowley, who was an anti-Semite, rejecting Christianity and all its constricting Jewish morality was imperative. With Jesus the Jew out of the way, Satan could be unchained and pronounce the new eon. As Crowley explains, the nature of Horus being force and fire, his new eon would be marked by the collapse of humanitarianism. The first act of his reign would naturally be to plunge the world into the catastrophe of a huge and ruthless war. Crowley's new eon has but a single commandment: "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Note how this language sounds biblical. The hallmark of Crowley's Satanism was to channel the Bible in ways that would encourage people to commit acts of evil, a tactic also employed by Hitler, with whom Crowley felt a kinship. Think about how Peterson is forever reminding his male followers of their pain and suffering, their rejection by women, and their bitterness and resentment. Think too about how he tells them who the enemy is: liberals, women, journalists, educators, Canadian politicians, members of the LGBTQ plus community, and so on. Also consider how he praises and defends Nazis along with mass shooters. And reflect on him instructing his acolytes to become monsters and channel their Jungian shadow, a concept Jung linked to Hitler and the Antichrist. And now, think back to the Nietzschean question Peterson asked: must we not ourselves become gods? The answer is yes. That is, we must become godlike, as Satan does in Peterson's beloved Paradise Lost, wherein Satan rebels, is flung out of heaven and into hell, and is resurrected, as it were, whereupon he raises war against the Jewish God in heaven. We must become a god like Horus, whose new eon will unleash Lucifer and turn the Judeo-Christian structure on its head. We must become a god like the Nietzschean Superman, who Nietzsche compared to the devil and suggested should replace Christianity, or what he called the religion of slaves, with a system based on man's right to practice unconstrained aggression and evil. We must become a god like Hitler became a god. Peterson has called Hitler a god and an evil god, and to many Germans he was indeed godlike. Nazism was an enormous, state-backed death cult that masqueraded as a religion. What I'm saying is, through his warped code, Peterson is trying to encourage his followers to become divinely homicidal and to eliminate the weak and inferior. You shouldn't be surprised. This is a fundamental tenet of fascism. But returning to the title of René Magritte's painting, The Son of Man, it's a reference to Christ's brother, Satan, and Peterson. You see, Peterson thinks he's the Son of Man, that is, the Son of God, that is, the spiritual offspring of Hitler, who, again, Peterson has likened to Lucifer and said was satanically possessed. Of course, Peterson is not the son of Hitler. Rather, he's a crazy Albertan redneck whose beliefs are the product of enculturation and psychosis. As touched on, he has called Hitler God, an evil God, in addition to God the Father, the Great Father, the Benevolent Father, and the Jovial Father of the race. When asked if he believes in God, Peterson becomes tetchy and pretends not to understand what that question means. Or he says, "I act as though God exists." But he can't act as though the Christian God exists, because in Maps of Meaning, as you heard, He distanced himself from people who still implicitly accepted, still acted out, the rules that made up the Christian game. Peterson acts as though Hitler exists by mimicking his speech, dress, and gestures as he's compelled to by his schizophrenia. In fact, the involuntary imitation of other people's actions and gestures is a common feature of schizophrenia. It's called echopraxia, and Peterson has spoken about it. Anyhow, Crowley's new Eon is a lot like Hitler's Third Reich, a society of superhumans uncontaminated by Jews or their effeminate ethics. When Crowley read Mein Kampf and Hitler Speaks, he believed that they had been influenced by his writings. They hadn't, but he was correct in seeing ideological congruity and even linguistic similarity. Crowley believed that he was a necromancer, and Hitler often spoke like one. Also, Crowley and Hitler borrowed language and ideas from Nietzsche. Moving on, we'll continue with JP saying the world is not made up of objects, but chaos and order.
I would like to propose instead that the world is made out of chaos and order, and that the quality of our being is dependent on how we manage the balance between the two.
In Maps of Meaning, Peterson says that the dragon of chaos is the horror and curiosity engendered by the stranger and foreigner. What a coincidence, because Hitler characterized the Jews as the dragon, chaos, strangers, and foreigners. Chaos, which Peterson emphasizes is the black portion of the yin-yang symbol, is code for non-whites or Jews. By contrast, order, which comprises the white half of the Taoist symbol, is code for Nazi order. As Peterson has said,
This is where the movie starts to draw on essentially Nazi symbolism, at least the symbolism of totalitarian states. And you think about a totalitarian state, you think about the Nazis and their goose stepping, and what's happening is that every single person in the military becomes an identical unit, right? They're all uniform, and they're all, in some sense, imitating the dictator in an absolutely perfect way. And so the dictator wants to impose strict uniformity on the entire population. That's order. Order.
Order is what happens when the dictator wants to impose strict uniformity on the population, and Peterson, dispenser of rules, commands his followers to get organized and get their lives in order. He has also said that it was the goal of the Nazis to establish order, which is exactly what Hitler said, and Aleister Crowley said he hoped Thelema could become the base for a Nazi new order.
Chaos. That's what manifests itself when we don't know what we're looking at.
He says, as he shows a picture of a dark, shadowy person.
It's chaos that we saw when the Twin Towers fell.
Because it was carried out by non-whites. Also, notice the image of the person plummeting to his death. Peterson likes to show startling images to make audiences anxious and more susceptible to his messaging.
It's chaos that looms when the partner you loved for decades reveals a lengthy affair. It's chaos that engulfs you when a loved one dies. Chaos is the unknown, the unexpected, the anomalous.
The unknown, the unexpected, and the anomalous are all code for non-whites or the other. In Mein Kampf, Hitler writes, I had discovered the relations existing between this destructive teaching of social democracy and the specific character of a people, the Jews, who, up to that time, had been to me almost unknown. And in Maps of Meaning, Peterson writes, Nazi hatred was motivated by mortal terror of the unknown. The unknown were the people the Nazis didn't know or didn't understand, like the Jews. Peterson also writes, rejection of the unknown is tantamount to identification with the devil. Peterson has been identifying with the devil for most of his life. Across his 3 books, he writes about the devil some 165 times, often in flattering terms. You'd think someone would have noticed. As for Peterson showing a man covered in blood alongside the painting The Scream by Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, the Nazis labeled Munch's art degenerate and confiscated all 82 of his pieces from German museums. However, the Nazi Party also organized Munch's funeral. Norway was under Nazi occupation when he died in 1944. This caused people to think he was a Nazi sympathizer, which he wasn't. He was, however, mentally ill, suffering from anxiety, depression, and probably schizophrenia. The scream was inspired by a hallucination, and hallucinations are one of Peterson's favorite subjects. He has said he had hundreds of them after his psychic split. Anyway, what is chaos?
It's the mater, the mother.
As opposed to the Great Father or God the Father, that is, Adolf Hitler. Fascism has little space for maternalism or femininity, hence why Peterson columns all things female under the heading chaos. Fascism is masculine, thus why Peterson directs his messages toward men, unless he's telling women not to seek careers or wear high heels or makeup in the workplace, which was what German women were told by the Nazis.
Chaos is the fruitfulness of nature and the terror of time.
The image on the left comes from the occult, which, remember, underpinned embryonic forms of National Socialism. Peterson has written and spoken about what he learned from the occult and has talked about the influence the occult had on Nazism. I've traced many of his occultic references back to Aleister Crowley. For example, in Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, Peterson includes an image of a winged sphere or egg replete with alchemical and Freemason symbols, that is, compasses and squares. Hitler and Crowley were inspired by Freemasonry. In any event, here's what Beyond Order says about the winged sphere, followed by what Aleister Crowley said about a winged egg. Peterson, at the very base of the image is a winged sphere. Atop that perches a dragon. Standing on the dragon is a two-headed human figure, one head male, the other female. The male head is associated with the image of the sun, the female with the moon. In between, but also above the two heads, is the symbol for Mercury. Crowley. It is the winged Orphic egg. This egg represents the essence of all that life which comes under the formula of male and female. The egg is gray, mingling white and black, thus it signifies the three supernals of the tree of life. The color of the serpent is purple, Mercury in the scale of the queen. A winged egg or sphere is also one of Crowley's symbols, as can be seen at the top of this book cover. Later, you'll see Peterson making more cryptic allusions to the occult and Crowley, but for now, let's return to him warning about chaos with metaphors that hardly anyone would comprehend.
It's an ocean of possibility surrounding the territory of human culture.
Chaos surrounds human culture, that is, predominantly non-white nations surround mainly white nations. Fascists define their zone as representing civilization and culture, and the zone of the other as epitomizing barbarism and ignorance.
It's the water of life, bringing sustenance to those parched by their own dry preconceptions. And it's the flood unleashed by an angry God when the ideas of men warp so badly that they can no longer be sustained.
The sentence about the flood may have been inspired by or plagiarized from Mircea Eliade, who Peterson has quoted to say, "The flood is the result of the sins or ritual faults of human beings." Eliade, who was a philosopher and historian of religion at the University of Chicago, had been an anti-Semite and Nazi sympathizer in his native Romania. He became intrigued by the occult and was almost certainly a crypto-fascist. In the line Peterson cited about the flood being the faults of sins, I think that he meant that a flood of non-whites was the result of the sin of race mixing. Hitler referred to the original sin of mankind and this racial pollution. And Eliade once grumbled about the deluge of Jews in Romania, saying, "Only a pro-German government can save us, because new waves of Jews are flooding into the country." In likening Jews to a flood, Eliade may have been reformulating Hitler, who said, "This Jewish plague would never have assumed the proportions of a veritable flood, which, since 1918, has smothered every vestige of the German nation." Before Peterson became famous, he used to cite Eliade as a major influence. But getting back to metaphors for chaos, one of many Petersonian code words for the other,
It's the yin of the Taoists. It's the paralyzing horror of the darkness. It's the treachery of our physical forms.
did you spot the dead baby? You probably assumed it was alive, like how people assume that when Peterson says he's interested in the Holocaust, he must be opposed to the Holocaust, or when he claims to be religious or interested in the Bible, he must be Christian. Peterson sells coffee mugs emblazoned with this image, which, again, features a dead baby, But he couldn't be a Nazi, Satanist, and occultist. That's absurd. The painting, called The Three Ages of Women and Death, was done by a German artist named Hans Baldung Green. And this painting, created by the same artist, was given by a Jewish couple to the Nazis in 1943 in exchange for safe passage from the Netherlands to Italy. Only, instead of making good on their promise, the Nazis sent the couple to concentration camps where they died. The Three Ages of Women and Death is backdropped by an ominous wasteland marked by a withered tree, a figure on a horse, and the Tower of Hell, wherein people are being tortured or burned by devils. In the lower right-hand corner, a dead baby lies on the ground. In the lower left-hand corner, an owl stares at the painting's observer. Three figures dominate. From left to right, a young, healthy-looking, nearly naked woman turning away from an older, emaciated, completely naked woman who is arm in arm with a skeleton clutching a broken lance. The dead baby has its hand on the lance's tip. The old woman is glaring at the perturbed young woman while pulling at her modest garment, as if to say, "Come, it's time for you to be like me, and then like him." On the young woman's cheek, we see a single teardrop. Peterson has said that the two women and the skeleton symbolize a succession of life. However, the trio actually signifies a progression toward death, because Peterson uses the image as a metaphor for Auschwitz. Later, on one PowerPoint slide, he will show three images of Jews in concentration camps. In the first image, they look healthy. In the second, emaciated. And in the third, they are corpses. The Three Ages of Women and Death is probably meant to complement or foreshadow that PowerPoint slide. Also, Peterson has spoken about the child in Auschwitz problem and how amazing it was that the order police developed to the point where they could take naked, pregnant women into fields and shoot them to death. Plus, he's always saying he could have been an Auschwitz guard who murdered Jews with enjoyment. Finally, in the original painting, there's an image of Jesus Christ in the sky, but Peterson asked the sketch artist to add a second Christ to the sky. The second Christ is probably Christ's brother, the Antichrist. Peterson has shown several images of Satan flying and plummeting from heaven into hell, and, as you will see, has added a picture of the devil to a photo of the Columbine killers.
It's the monster under the bed.
Observe how the monster under the bed is frightening a child who's white.
And it's the snake that eternally lurks in the garden.
Hitler referred to the Jews as monsters and snakes, and when he wanted to initiate the final solution, he told his underlings to turn Germany into a Garden of Eden. Peterson would know this because it's mentioned in the book Ordinary Men, which he urges people to read so they can understand that they are the Nazis. As for monsters, Hitler said, Jewish children are monsters that are a mixture of man and ape. This is the sort of language that Peterson is channeling.
Chaos is also what you encounter when you boldly go where no one's gone before. Order, by contrast, that's where you are when everything is working properly. When the trains run on time, that's order.
And so the dictator wants to impose strict uniformity on the entire population. That's order. Order.
When you have a happy and secure home, that's order.
That's order. Order.
Order is when the trains run on time. Bit of a giveaway, don't you think? Peterson has also said that the Germans are good at order, and Hitler was extremely orderly and high in orderliness. Regarding the reference to the sitcom Father Knows Best, it has to do with Hitler, leader of the fatherland. To restate, fascism is predicated on masculinity and patriarchy. Plus, once more, Hitler is God the Father, the Great Father, and so on. I understand it sounds strange. Peterson is off his rocker, but Father Knows Best means Hitler knows best, or Nazism is best. Indeed, at Harvard, Peterson said that the best group to be a part of is a neo-Nazi group. Fascism hinges on the best group opposing inferior groups.
Order keeps the operating room clean.
Order eliminates germs. And Peterson has quoted a book by Richard A. Königsberg called Hitler's Ideology, Embodied Metaphor, Fantasy, and History, to illustrate how Hitler repeatedly labeled the Jews parasites and germs to appeal to disgust sensitivity. As I keep saying, he lectures on Hitler's rhetorical techniques and then practices them, but nobody notices.
Orders what God calls out of chaos at the beginning of time and offers to men and women as a dwelling place.
He's talking about God the Father, or Hitler, offering men and women a dwelling place. Indeed, in Mein Kampf, Hitler talks about the need for the proletariat to take pride in their quote-unquote dwelling place.
It's an island of stability in a sea of ignorance.
Order, or white society, is an island of stability in a sea of non-white ignorance. Also, Keep Calm and Carry On is, of course, a reference to World War II, the British Isles, and the Nazis. Peterson uses British, Canadian, and American signs and symbols to clandestinely promote Nazism.
It's the yang of the Taoists.
In Maps of Meaning, Peterson includes a handy yin-yang codebreaker to help us decipher his crypto-fascism. He says yang represents order, masculinity, day, the known, authoritarianism, and fascism. Yin, on the other hand, signifies chaos, femininity, night, the unknown, decadence, and nihilism. If you're wondering why the opposites of authoritarianism and fascism are not democracy and multiculturalism, but rather decadence and nihilism, it has to do with Hitler. In Mein Kampf, Hitler rails against the cultural decadence caused by race mixing and says the Weimar Republic was a symptom of human decadence. As for nihilism, in a speech Hitler made in 1933, he said, "We will declare a merciless war against spiritual, political, and cultural nihilism. Germany will not drown in anarchist communism." In 1934, he said, "We do not intend to be attacked by those who perceive nihilism as the only fitting framework for their own futile activities. Whenever criticism of our party becomes an end in itself, chaos must be its ultimate consequence." And here we have another coincidence. JP and AH are both opposed to decadence and nihilism, but let's return to the good doctor telling us about order.
It's the walls of the city. It's the principles of the Constitution and the uniform of the police.
Order is the walls of the city, he says. And in 1936, Hitler began a speech by saying, "I thank you for these few days within the walls of the old city." Order is the principles of the Constitution, Peterson says. And in 1932, Hitler said, "We National Socialists stand for the precepts of the Constitution." Order is the uniform of the police, says Peterson, who has defended and empathized with Hitler's order police.
Order is the stone that lasts and keeps the barbarians at bay. Taken to an extreme, however, order becomes tyranny and imperils the soul.
So here he is admitting that his conceptualization of order is connected to Nazi order, like the kind displayed at Nuremberg rallies. To see him rave about Nuremberg rallies, I suggest watching my video, Jordan Peterson, Along Came Hitler.
When human beings stray, we become rigid and unbending, or dissolute and careless.
Observe the German imperial eagle and think of the bird iconography on the walls of Peterson's home. It's not a coincidence. The pieces of bird art, done by an indigenous artist, are meant as stand-ins for the Nazi imperial eagle and Horus, Crowley's symbol for the devil. Of course, the indigenous artist wouldn't have had any idea what the designs would mean to Peterson, and that was the point. If you're thinking I'm seeing connections where none exist, it is Peterson who sees connections where none exist, which is a feature of schizophrenia called patternicity or apophenia. Occultists might experience this too, like Gerald Sister, author of Hitler and the Age of Horus.
We can no longer think outside the box, or we drift without purpose and then drown in possibility.
First, I'll address the image on the right of the comic book called Slackers. Peterson probably chose it because the characters look like the Columbine killers, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who Peterson often mentions when talking about the Nazis. At the U of T, he told his students they should read Eric Harris's diary, omitting that it's filled with praise for the Nazis. The date Harris and Klebold chose to murder their classmates and commit suicide was that of Hitler's birthday. Peterson may have chosen the cartoon image because the Columbine killers spawned a legion of fans who immortalized their heroes in cartoonish sketches like this one. Later, Peterson will show a photograph of the Columbine killers. His slacker image was probably meant to foreshadow this photo, like the painting The Three Ages of Women and Death was meant to foreshadow the pictures of Jews in concentration camps, which you'll see shortly. As for the image that says The Organization Man, it's the cover of a book, and probably another surreptitious allusion to Hitler. Remember when Peterson said that Hitler was an organizational genius? And when he wrote, "How many of us would not be Hitlers, assuming we had the ambition, dedication, and power of organization?" When speaking about God the Father, Peterson habitually uses the word organize or derivatives thereof. For example, he has said that you can't say that Hitler was a poor organizer, and so you see here, at this Nuremberg rally, all those people are lined up. It's absolutely perfect. And then you see the same thing on the right here, eh? I mean, look at the organization of that.
We want tyranny because we despise what we don't know. Or we want anarchy because we refuse responsibility.
Like Hitler wanted tyranny and anarchy. Like the Columbine killers wanted tyranny and anarchy. In 12 Rules for Life, Peterson quotes Eric Harris's diary to say, "If you recall your history, the Nazis came up with the final solution to the Jewish problem. Kill them all. Well, in case you haven't figured it out, I say, kill mankind. No one should survive." Peterson's messages are intended for other mentally disturbed males who want tyranny and anarchy.
Either way, we risk exposing ourselves to the opposite principle. Too much order makes collapse into chaos ever more likely. Too much chaos calls the devils of totalitarianism out from the crevices where they hide. The Buddhists believe that life is suffering. Jews and Christians agree. The former remember a long history of persecution.
Remember when he said he was going to discuss it, the most real thing he knows? This PowerPoint slide is as close to it as we're going to get. The Holocaust happened and could happen again. The original event was overseen by an organized man from Austria. The sequel could be initiated by an order-obsessed man from Alberta, one who hears voices, one who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, one who says nice things about the Nazis, Lucifer, and the occult.
The latter worship a God who is simultaneously human and betrayed and crucified.
We return to the subject of Christ on the cross. Think of Peterson's cobra strangling a demonic-looking Jesus, and Crowley's Horus, who can take the form of a winged snake, pecking out Jesus' eyes. Regarding this image, Peterson could have chosen one that didn't feature the initials INRI, but he did, and he has linked INRI to the occult.
Oh, there's the idea is also there in Christianity. So there's an occult interpretation. There's letters on Christ's cross, INRI, Jesus Christ,
what is
King
that?
of the It means Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, and it was put there by the Romans. But there's an occult interpretation in Latin, which I can't reproduce, but it means through fire all things are renewed.
Or as Crowley explains, Horus, the god of force and fire, secures his new eon after a purge marked by blood and fire. Crowley writes, INRI, me crucified, me slain, interred, arisen, inspire, tarot, me glorified, anointed, fill with frenzied fire.
When men and women cry out to heaven in the face of their suffering, what is it that they can call forth?
The painting he just showed is by William Blake. Apart from being an artist and poet, Blake was interested in mysticism, magic, alchemy, and demonic possession. He was much admired by Crowley. Crowley, my instinct told me that Blake was right in saying, the lust of the goat is the glory of God. Peterson, quoting Blake, the lust of the goat is the bounty of God. The poem cited by Crowley and Peterson is called Proverbs of Hell. Anyway, what is it that people who are suffering from, say, schizophrenia can call forth? Meaning, that is, the belief that there can be a Fourth Reich, or sequel to the Holocaust.
Meaning.
This icon is a neo-Nazi symbol. In its center you can see a swastika rotating in the wrong direction amidst what is supposed to represent the shattered Reich, done in the colors of the Nazi flag and the German flag. The Son of Man, Jordan Peterson, who's crazy as hell, will unify the fragments and see to it that the swastika rotates in the right direction.
Meaning is not a rational phenomenon. We detect it with our being, not with our intellect.
Peterson has said that, unlike communism, Nazism was not an intellectual movement, but an embodied movement that fired people up in ways they didn't fully understand. Again, meaning is code for Nazism, because Nazism gives Peterson meaning. And remember, for Peterson, an absence of meaning is nihilism, and the opposite of nihilism is fascism. Maps of meaning signify something like an esoteric guide to Nazism, and was probably borrowed from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is about the Holocaust, and which Peterson cites in Maps of Meaning. On the PowerPoint slide, we see Geppetto wishing upon a star and possibly supplicating before Christ, who's been consumed by a watery chaos. According to historian Thomas Weber, Hitler compared both himself and his party to Jesus or described Jesus as his role model. Geppetto represents the benevolent father, which, as you know, is a term Peterson has used to describe Hitler. Geppetto is wishing upon a star, perhaps because Hitler said, "Germany's star will rise and yours will fall," as well as, "We have faith that one day heaven will bring the Germans back into a Reich over which there shall be no Soviet star, no Jewish Star of David, but the symbol of German labor, the swastika." Hitler also said, "Amongst countless pale stars, a few suns radiate." And after Jordan Peterson told Russell Brand about the occultic interpretation of INRI, he defended social inequality by saying,
It applies to the mass of stars. So there's a very few stars in the Milky Way that have most of the matter.
Peterson uses Disney movies like Pinocchio as vehicles for his crypto-fascism. He has even said that The Lion King employs Nazi imagery. Of course, Disney movies, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, were used by the Nazis as propaganda. In Peterson's twisted interpretation of Pinocchio, Geppetto represents Hitler, Pinocchio is Peterson, a lying marionette whose strings are pulled by forces he doesn't understand, that is, schizophrenia, and the whale that swallows Pinocchio signifies what Peterson has called cultural Marxism, or what the Nazis termed Judeo-Bolshevism. Pinocchio must save his father from the belly of the whale, and Peterson must save and resurrect the jovial father of the race. Anyway, meaning, or Nazism, is not
A rational phenomenon. We detect it with our being, not with our intellect, which it should guide rather than follow.
we detect meaning, that is Nazism, with our being, capitalized, a word Peterson says he borrowed from Martin Heidegger, who was a professor and Nazi who promoted the Hitlerite faith to his students.
When chaos and order are balanced, we have one foot in each domain. That's the meaning that life more abundantly depends on. In that place, we're secure and confident, but challenged enough to be alert and developing.
He often says this: we need to have one foot in order and the other in chaos. He means we need to confront chaos, which, recall, is comprised of foreigners. Next, you're going to see references to Crowley.
In that place, we play each game, not just to win, but to become better players at all games in the future.
This image of a robed man wearing what looks to be a conical hat, along with a cross and a dove, is meant to approximate images of Aleister Crowley, like this one, wherein he's wearing a conical hat and appears to be cradling a dove. Crowley sometimes wore a cross on his robe, and the dove was featured in an occultic order to which Crowley belonged, as can be seen in this image. The image from the American $1 bill, called the Eye of Providence, is a substitute for Crowley's all-seeing Eye of Horus within an Egyptian pyramid. Indeed, you will see Peterson display a picture of the all-seeing eye along with a statuette of Horus.
Such meaning, properly nurtured, can produce love for life and gratitude so deep that the terrible limitations of being are justified.
Why did he show a picture of Beethoven alongside the sheet music for Ode to Joy? Beethoven's Symphony No. 9's fourth movement is based on Ode to Joy, a poem by Friedrich Schiller, which has a part that reads, "Brothers, above the starry canopy, there must dwell a loving father." Peterson's loving father, that is Hitler, said how exasperated Schiller would have been, and Beethoven achieved more in the realm of music than all Englishmen of the past and present put together. The Nazis held up classical music as a shining example of German culture. Put another way, they used it as propaganda. So does Peterson. During a talk at Wycliffe College, Peterson had this to say about Symphony No. 9's fourth movement, which he refers to as the third movement, likely in a clandestine reference to the Third Reich.
I remember in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell down, there was a great celebration in Berlin, and the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra played a part in it, and they came out to a section of the wall that had been knocked down, where there was a huge crowd, and played Beethoven's Ninth. And I remember watching that, the great third movement, the triumphant third movement. And it was so wonderful to see everyone there and hear this orchestra playing those unbelievably remarkable notes in triumph that this horror show had finally come to a halt.
He means the horror show of Germany's partition had finally come to a halt. People might assume that his exuberance would have to do with the democratization of East Germany and other former Soviet republics. But no, it stems from the final defeat of Hitler's nemesis, the Soviet Union, and the reunification of the country that Peterson would have liked to work for between 1933 and 1945. Oh, and when he gushed about Beethoven, he was channeling Hitler. Peterson, the great third movement, the triumphant third movement. Hitler, the great national movement, the triumphant march of our movement. Finally, after Peterson fist-pumped about Germany's reunification, he mentioned Auschwitz and the child in Auschwitz problem. From Beethoven to his favorite death camp and dead babies, all within a few minutes. With Peterson, the subject of Auschwitz is always there, braiding just below the surface. As mentioned, he says he could work at Auschwitz with happiness and feeling deeply satisfied. And that's because he wants so much for other people to suffer like he has from schizophrenia and the psychological abuse served up by his father, Walter, who's probably also a Nazi sympathizer. Walter not only accepted an imitation Nazi Warrenson as a gift from Jordan, but defended a conservative politician who was punished by his party for accepting a donation from a member of Canada's Aryan Guard. Walter thought that a Canadian politician taking money from Nazis was fine.
It's in this manner that paradise is regained.
Hitler's son seems to be struggling a bit with his notes. Perhaps he should have gotten his life in order and bought some recipe cards. By regain paradise, he means do away with all the darkies so we can live within the pristine walled enclosure among people who are preternaturally white. The painting is German and called Paradisgartlein. Somehow it got overlooked as official Nazi art. Hitler reminded citizens of his Reich who were walking about in the garden of nature of his iron law of nature, which compels the various species to keep within the definite limits of their own life forms when propagating and multiplying their kind. Plus, to restate, Hitler commenced the final solution by telling his minions to turn Germany into a Garden of Eden. And this brings us to the intruder in the garden, in the lower right-hand corner, a baby dragon slain by St. George, who's behind the tree. This Nazi propaganda picture depicts St. George slaying the Judeo-Bolshevik dragon. And this Petersonian propaganda picture urges us to slay the dragon in his lair before he comes to your village. Observe how Peterson's dragon is red, as were the Judeo-Bolshevik dragons in Nazi propaganda posters, as can be seen here. Hitler referred to the Jew-ridden communists as the Great Red Dragon, which, as touched upon, is how the devil is depicted in the Book of Revelation.
The alternative is to live an unbalanced life. This is not good, because the terrible forces of chaos and order will tear an unbalanced person apart.
What he's saying is, if you're unbalanced, for example, schizophrenic, failing to embrace meaning, that is, Nazism, will leave you feeling tortured, like the man in the picture who's being tortured by demons.
He'll become overwhelmed, hopeless, bitter, vengeful, and finally, cruel. She'll become willfully blind, narrow, bored, cynical, and vicious. When life is unbalanced, people work against it.
Like the Columbine killers worked against it on Hitler's birthday. Observe how Peterson has affixed an image of the devil or demon to the bottom right-hand corner of the PowerPoint slide, and recall how he asked an artist to add another Christ, really the Antichrist, to the portrait that featured a dead baby.
Because they're angry at the dreadful, limited conditions of existence. To hell with it. That's the curse of the embittered. Hell is where they're headed, and where they'd like to drag everyone else. This is revenge against God, or the conditions of being, whichever you prefer.
Mass murder is revenge against God, or the conditions of being, he says, as he shows a picture of the devil. In Maps of Meaning, the caption under the same picture reads, "The devil as aerial spirit and ungodly intellect," indicating that Satan is an intellectual. Peterson has said that what motivated the Columbine killers was something satanic. Note how he provided two theories as to why the Columbine killers might have decided to murder other children before saying, whichever you prefer. What he meant was, you choose whatever reason you want. Also, do you understand how what he said corresponds with Crowley's new eon? The satanic Columbine killers murdered out of revenge against God, or the unfair conditions of being. You think you can make our lives miserable? Well, we can do what you do to others. We can become godlike. This is Peterson's latent message. You know you're suffering. Channel your bitterness and resentment and spite God by becoming a god. Strike a blow to the Judeo-Christian structure that prevents us from acting like demons.
It's motivated by the desire that things suffer for their inadequacy and cease to be. How might a person live in reality? This is an empirical, not a rational question. Start by watching yourself, as if you're someone you know very little about. See when you're where you should be psychologically, and see when you're not.
So there's the all-seeing eye of Horus, along with his statuette of Horus. Be aware that in 1904, Crowley wrote the Book of the Law, the one he tried sending to Hitler, in Cairo, in 3 days with a swan pen via automatic writing after having been possessed by Satan. In 12 Rules for Life, Peterson says he got up to some automatic writing with his pen of light, light being an allusion to the light of Lucifer, who Peterson often describes poetically as the light bringer.
Don't think about it. Watch. Then practice spending more time in the place you want to be. You're closer to paradise there and farther from hell. Do whatever you have to stay there. Within a month, given disciplined effort, you'll be in the proper place more often. In a year, much more often. In 3 years, if you're lucky, most of the time. When asked about the kingdom of heaven, Christ said, it's like a mustard seed, the smallest of all seeds. But when it falls on prepared ground, it produces a great plant and becomes a shelter for all the birds of the sky.
His mustard seed story may have something to do with this image of Hitler seeding the fields.
It's from such small beginnings that great things grow. Thank you.
As for the painting of Mary and Jesus, it looks a little like the Mutter und Kind propaganda churned out by the Nazis. It also resembles this painting, done by the Great Father, Adolf Hitler, called The Mother Mary with the Holy Child Jesus Christ. Jesus, of course, was the Son of Man, so Peterson's opening and closing images correlate. Why didn't Peterson explain what the most real thing he knows is? Why did he endorse order and then link order to Nazism, including Nazi atrocities, as seen in the pictures of the Jewish corpses? Why did so many of his images have connections to Nazism, occultism, Satanism, and mental illness? Why did he talk about mass shooters who admired Hitler? Why did he show an image of a dead baby, backdropped by the Tower of Hell, wherein people are being tortured or burned by devils? And why did he show a man jumping out of a building or a woman stabbing a pie with a knife? Why? I will tell you why. Because he's a violence-obsessed lunatic fascinated with Nazism, Satanism, and occultism. He didn't redefine reality, he redefined insanity. And the audience applauded. My name is Troy Parfit, and I'm the author of The Devil and His Due, How Jordan Peterson Plagiarizes Adolf Hitler. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe.